This is Professor Gavoor. This is the first lecture moving online during this COVID-19 crisis that we're in. And let's go over chapter 6, which is called Consumer Choices. We're going to talk about consumption choices, how changes in income and prices affect consumption choices, a little bit about behavioral economics and an alternative framework for consumer choice. Every one of these chapters starts with one of these slides that they lay out something like higher education is viewed as a good investment if one can afford it. Is spending on education only considered beneficial during the good times since incomes decrease during recessions? Actually, during the Great Recession, the college enrollment soared, and there was a glut of lawyers, and people went back and got MBAs and DBAs and all kinds of degrees to try to enhance their marketability, and it soured a lot of people, especially older people that had gone back to school trying to kickstart and restart their careers, and not realizing that they were probably too old to re-enter the workforce after being out for 2 or 3 years. But from your perspective, let's think about this. You're in college, you're taking this course, you have friends that chose not to go to college, and people make choices all the time. I went to college. I had a cousin that wanted a sports car, really wanted a sports car. So I was in college and he was working in a factory and driving around in a Corvette. It's what he really wanted. He made it happen. College is kind of, an education is what I really wanted. I wanted a sports car too, but I wanted college more. So how do we make these choices of, and how do we trade off, and what do we decide which is more important to us, and therefore act on that? Well, when we have consumption choices, and again, in this world of microeconomics, we look at two usually unrelated products, and we have some amount of money that we can spend on either, and we decide what we want to spend it on. So there's a budget constraint, which we've talked about before, shows possible combinations of the goods that are affordable and within the consumer's our own budgets. And then we're going to add this concept of utility, the satisfaction derived from consuming, from our choices. And the idea we're going to bring up here is marginal utility. And we talked about early on in this class this concept of marginal analysis. And basically, when we talk about margin, it's talking about when we change in quantity, what happens to the change of the other variable, like marginal revenue, marginal profit, marginal cost. And we're going to spend a lot of the rest of the time talking about those kinds of terms. So if I produce or consume one more item, what will be my change in profit? What will be my change in revenue? What will be my change in cost? And we're kicking it off with this change in utility. We already decided a util is a non-measurable relative value of satisfaction. So we're really still sticking with this utility concept right now. So marginal utility is called the change in total utility divided by the change in quantity. So if we think about what's the utility of having a donut? We get a lot of pleasure from a donut. What's the utility in the next donut? We wouldn't eat the next donut unless there was some value in it, some utility, some gratification to us. How about the third, the fourth, the fifth donut? And I know now I'm making you all sick, but the utility would be positive or we wouldn't do it. But we all know that the additional utility gained, or the marginal utility actually goes down. The law of diminishing marginal utility. That each marginal unit of a good consumed provides less of an addition to the utility than the previous unit. So the total utility might go up, but it goes up at a lesser and lesser rate. So if I have, oh my God, 25 utils for consuming the first donut, and then the second donut, that was so good I want another one. Maybe the second one is only going to be 15. By the time you get to the fourth donut, you're probably only adding 5 utils or 1 util, or however you look at it. So this is marginal utility. We are accustomed with the budget line that we've talked about before. You know, Jose has an income of $56. Movies cost $7. T-shirts cost $14. The points on the budget line show the combination of T-shirts and movies that are affordable. So we have, you know, the points, they've named them after famous letters, I guess. PQRST. And you start with 4 T-shirts, no movies, 3 T-shirts, 2 movies, 2 T-shirts, 4 movies, 1 T-shirt, 6 movies, and 8 movies, no T-shirts. And we could talk about the opportunity cost of each, but we've already covered that previously. So which one of these points do you pick? They're all on the budget line, but what is the preference? What is the mix that appeals to Jose the most? That's what we want to talk about here. So we talk about marginal utility per dollar. First of all, if we have utility of each of these combinations, I would just look at each of them and find out the utility and pick the one with the most utility. That's the easiest way to do a problem like this. But there's also another way, is a marginal utility per dollar. So we have our marginal utility divided by price. You always choose the item with the next greatest marginal utility per dollar. When the budget is exhausted, the utility maximizing choice should occur. So we're looking at, I'm going to spend, $4 on a movie, or $7 on a movie, $14 on a T-shirt. What is the marginal utility of going from 0 to 1 T-shirt, 0 to 1 movie, or in this case, 0 to 2 movies? You probably want to maybe look at it that way, and go in increments of 2, since we're talking about the opportunity cost being the same. And look at the marginal utility for price. What is the value of going from 0 to 1 movie, 1 to 2 movies? And as long as that's greater marginal utility per price than buying the first T-shirt, I would continue buying movies until the marginal utility of the first T-shirt becomes more. And then I could continue that way. Of course, no one does that in a store. You don't think, okay, I've got $10, I want to buy some apples and oranges. I don't say, well, what's my marginal utility per price? Oh yes, it requires that I'd probably buy 1 apple. Well, now what? What's my marginal utility for the first orange or the second apple, and divide that by the price of both? Oh, I still want to pick another apple, and then what's the marginal utility of the first orange versus the third apple per price? And in this case, maybe I want to pick the orange now. No one does that. They just automatically do it in their head. I got about $10 and I can buy 3 oranges and 5 apples for that money, and that's what I want to do. How changes in income and price affect consumption choices? Well, we know that it does that, right? We already talked about income elasticity of demand. So obviously, if we have more money, we spend more money on things. In these times of COVID-19, we're talking about probably, even though we have the same money perhaps, and are working from home, we're probably, our spending habits have probably changed to buy more things that we think are needed for the less goods are no longer available. So everybody's going crazy and buying toilet paper and paper towels and hand sanitizers and those things, and not buying other stuff. But utility and marginal utility can be used to analyze how consumer choices change when the budget constraints shift in response to changes in income and price. So here's concert ticket and overnight hotel stays. These are both things that we think would be normal goods because the more money, income we have, the more likely we're to travel and stay overnight in a hotel, and the more likely we are to splurge on concert tickets. So the utility maximizing point on the original budget constraint is M. Here's the original budget constraints. I can either buy 5 overnight hotel stays or go to 20 concerts, and there's a budget line. And it's saying the budget constraint is 3,8, which means 3 overnight hotel stays and 8 concert tickets would be how you want to spend it. But now let's say the person's income rises, and we have 3 different choices now of trade-offs between these. Notice there's no prices involved or budget actually specified. So the utility maximizing choice on the second one is, I don't know, what point would it be? It could be M. The ratio could change as your budget increases. You could opt for more travel and just one more movie or concert ticket. Or less, half the number of concert tickets. Or you could increase both. You could take your movies up to 20 and increase your overnight stays to 5. Or you could reduce the number of, and what is the preference? The preference here is one thing, maybe the preference here is something else. On a new budget, a choice like N will be made if both the goods are normal goods. If overnight stays is an inferior good, a choice like P will be made. If concert tickets are an inferior good, a choice like Q will be made. Here's another one, where let's say only the price of one thing. We have cameras and baseball bats. And let's say the price of baseball bats increases, which means here's our budget maximizing point here. And utility maximizing point is M. X number of baseball bats and X number of cameras. It kind of is a weird example because most people don't want more than one camera and their phone suffices. But if you're a photographer, you might want more than one camera. If you're a baseball playing photographer, you may want a couple baseball bats because you never know what your feeling is that day. I want one with more heft. I want one with a wider diameter or thinner diameter grip handle. So you have a variety of different baseball bats. If one breaks, you need a spare. If a camera breaks and you're on a job, you need a spare. So at the original budget constraint here, you could buy this many cameras or this many baseball bats. And let's say the utility maximizing point is right there. This is where the consumer is going to be the happiest. But let's say the price of baseball bats go up. So if you're only going to buy baseball bats, you can buy less of them with the same budget. The price of cameras doesn't change, so this point does not move. And so this budget line just pivots around the anchor here on the camera. So it moves this way. Now we have these points, L, K, H, J, K, and L. Again, naming these points after famous letters. He might want to buy the same number of baseball bats and less cameras, depending on the importance of it to the individual that's involved here. Or he may want to buy less baseball bats because they're more expensive and the same number of cameras, which would be like a point here or maybe a point here. So the dashed line makes it possible to see whether the new consumption choices involve less of both goods or less of one good and more of the other. So if we go here, he's going to buy the same amount of baseball bats, but because baseball bats cost more, he's going to buy less cameras. And if we look at this dotted line, well, he's going to definitely he wants to buy the same number of cameras, but because baseball bats went up, he has to buy less baseball bats. Now, and just as we explained, the choice might be L because it would mean more baseball bats and less camera, but since the price of baseball bats went up, it's less likely that this would happen. So, in response to higher prices, chooses to consume less of the product with the higher price. Substitution effect. When a price, we've talked about this already, when a price changes, consumers have an incentive to consume less of a good with relatively higher price and more of a good with relatively lower price. This happens simultaneously with the income effect, where the entire budget line moves parallel up or down, depending on if your income has moved up. The income effect is what we're talking about here. A higher price means that the buying power of income has been reduced, even though the actual income has not changed. So, can we substitute one good for the other? If they're normal goods or inferior goods, the behavior of the buying person, the consumer, will change. So this is where an actual demand curve can be developed. Changes in the price of a good leads to the budget constraint to rotate. And the rotation is exactly this, where one side remains fixed and everything else moves. So in the budget constraint, the rotation in the budget means that when individuals are seeking their highest utility, the quantity that demanded of the good will change. If we look at it this way, the logical foundations of a demand curve are based on a whole succession of these. And the next picture will illustrate it. So in the top picture here, we see that we have housing and we have everything else. Now, if everything else stays the same, ceteris paribus, and only the housing prices increase. So here's where we are now, and then housing prices go up. If you're only going to spend all of your income on housing, you could buy this amount of housing, and then it starts decreasing to various numbers. And on each one of these budget constraints, you have a utility maximizing point. How much you're going to spend on housing relative to everything else. And the quantity that the housing price, how many people are going to buy housing at this highest price is going to be less quantity of people buying houses, probably spending more, and they're probably spending their money on everything else. Everything else increases a little bit as housing prices go up. So you start on this curve. Here's your budget maximizing point M0 at Q0, P0, and then at the next line, when housing prices go up, you have this quantity, and there's your budget maximizing point M1 and Q1, and so forth and so on as you go to budget constraint 3, the next higher level of pricing, you get Q2, and then you go finally to Q3 and M3. And if you relate this to the price of housing and the quantities, you bring these points down. So we still have Q0 through Q3, and we have P0 through P3, and we then connect the dots. That's how a demand curve is actually created. And I think they take polls, they looked at what happens over history in terms, and economists in the federal government may come up with demand curves based on various different items, based on the behavior of what people do. But generally, you want to create a demand curve using this kind of approach. It's kind of an interesting graph, and we'll not be doing that, of course, in this class. So, next. One of the things we look at is behavioral economics, an alternative framework for consumer choice. We've already talked about this. Traditional economics assumes rationality. We know that. People take all available information and make consistent and informed decisions that are in their best interest. Assumes human beings have complete control. And there's this idea of fungible goods comes up. Units of a good that are capable of mutual substitution with each other and carry equal value to the individual. That's a crappy definition. I'm sorry, I used a technical term there I shouldn't have used. It's not a exciting or easily understood definition. So when I don't understand something, I go to Investopedia. What are fungible goods? They refer to securities or other items that are equivalent or consistent and consist of many identical parts such that for practical purposes they're interchangeable. Material items, securities, and other financial instruments may be considered fungible goods. If goods are sold by weight or number, then they are probably not fungible goods. Like a house is probably not a fungible good because each individual one has a different value. So fungible goods are items that are interchangeable because they are identical to each other. So investments, I'm going to invest X amount of dollars in this or X amount of dollars in that. I can trade these things. Commodities, common shares of stocks, options, and dollar bills are examples of fungible goods. Assets like diamond, land, baseball cards are not fungible because each one has unique qualities that add or subtract value. Behavioral economics, as we've talked about already, takes into account people's state of mind. Am I buying baseball bats and, the camera baseball bat thing? Well, if I'm going on vacation, I'm probably more interested in maybe a camera than a baseball bat. If it's a nice spring day and spring weather is coming and I'm on a baseball team, and I'm probably thinking more about baseball bats than I am about cameras. So it changes with time, it changes with perspective, it changes with all of those things. So we enrich our understanding of decision making by integrating those insights of psychology. We investigate how given dollar amounts can mean different things to individuals depending on the situation. This can lead to decisions that appear outwardly inconsistent or rational to the third-party observer. I don't know why you bought 6 baseball bats, and you don't understand why I have 3 cameras, and neither of us understand why that other guy has 17 baseball bats and 14 cameras. So it's this idea of behavioral economics, like we've talked about before, is a very interesting concept, but hard to study at this introductory level because the mathematics just get a little bit out of hand. Okay, so here's a question here based on that original first slide. Is education worth it? Why spend the money to go to college during a recession? Why spend the money to go to college at all? If it costs you $200,000 to get a college education and $250,000 to buy a McDonald's franchise or some kind of franchise, what's worth it? If you're unemployed or underemployed, working fewer hours than you like, the opportunity cost of your time is low. If you're unemployed and don't have to give up work hours and income by, if you are employed, I'm guessing you don't have to give up. If you're unemployed, you don't have to give up work hours to go to college. Do you think the data supports the idea that more education means less unemployment? Yes and no. It depends. Probably the people that are most able to work from home during this COVID crisis are people that have white collar jobs, which are probably more, have larger requirements that you have a degree. People that don't have degrees tend to have to be at their place of employment more. And I'm just I don't have data necessarily for this, but I'm thinking about waiters, waitresses, taxi drivers, Uber drivers, hotel clerks, this and that. If you have to be at your job, you can't work from home, and most of those jobs that require you to be there are more blue collar than white, even though there are exceptions. A doctor has to be at a doctor's office to see patients. So, anyway, the impact of education and earnings on the unemployment rates. This is data all the way back from 2002. We talk about professional and terminal degrees, and we're talking about, I think the blue line is the median weekly earnings. And median, as you recall, means the middlemost point. It's not necessarily the average. When you have a skewed distribution, the median is a better measure of central tendency than the mean. That's why they always talk about median income, median household income. They don't talk about average household income, because everybody's bunched up along the zero to the 100,000, or if it's a week, well, let's say annual, to the $100,000 mark, and then you got Bill Gates and Warren Buffett way the heck out there, and that's going to skew the average higher because the weight of their salary is so great, even though there's only a few of them. The median is actually a better measure of central tendency. It's a very skewed distribution. So let's look at this. Professional degree, $1,700 a week. Doctoral degree, $1,600 a week. Master's degree, $13,000. Bachelor's degree, $1,000. And that's about $52,000 a year if you do it on a weekly basis. And then associate degree, some college, high school diploma, and it just keeps going down. And if you look at the unemployment during the Great Recession, you'll see that the employment of professional degrees was 2.1, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5. Associate degrees it just kept going up. So there is some value to education according to this. The median average weekly income was $815, and the nation unemployment average in 2012. This is a good 4 years into the Great Recession. Actually, we're probably coming out of it with 6.8. So it's kind of interesting, the value of education. Does it help? Well, oftentimes the people up here tend to be in leadership positions in their organizations, and then less likely to be lay themselves off. And they're probably trying to save money by laying these folks off. All right, that's it for the lecture today. I will put another one out, probably showing the homework assignments and talking you through those, and maybe using a little Excel to make those work. All right, thank you very much, and this is the way we'll be conveying new material the rest of this semester. Thank you.